welcome to the Huddle Breakdown with me, Laura Bradburn. I'm joined by James and a returning Alan. Alan, you've been on your travels. How were they?
Very good, yeah. Little trip across the country, Hadrian's Wall Trail. So start in a place called Bowness on Solway, which is about 15 miles from Carlisle on the west coast. And then you end up in, believe it or not, Wallsend. So aptly named in Newcastle. About
well done.
5 days later. So yeah, no, it was good fun. I won't pretend that bits of it weren't very grueling. There's a bit in the middle, which is where there's still bits of wall. The reason there's still bits of wall is because the environment is so inhospitable and inaccessible that nobody nicked all the stones. They only nicked all the stones from the low-lying bits. Yeah. And so there's actually very little physical wall left. But in the middle, where it's very gnarly, and on the escarpment where it's kind of up and downy, there's still quite a few bits of wall there because, as I say, it's just nobody would be stupid enough to go up there and then try and carry lumps of rock back down the hill and through the dales and up the other sides. So that was good. The new hip got a fairly good workout, it has to be said. Feeling a bit stiff, I'm not going to lie, but it was a good week.
Excellent. A few miles on the new hip won't do any bother, I'm sure.
Just one piece of advice I would give people. Uh-huh. So all the guidebooks tell you to do it from east to west, right?
Right.
We did it west to east, and I can tell you for sure that having a stiff breeze behind you is way more preferable than walking for days into a howling gale. So, yeah, don't say you haven't been warned.
I can see that. So did you rough it? Were you camping, or did you go for a posh hotel somewhere halfway?
We had a friend who wasn't interested in walking was happy to come along, and so there's a couple of us doing it, and what we did is we rented a cottage right in the middle, and then he would pick us up and take us back to the start and end points on each day, and then just kind of entertain himself during the day. So that worked out really well. So yeah, no, it certainly wouldn't be camping. That's not my scene at all.
James, what would be the equivalent in America of trekking along Hadrian's Wall? I'm trying to think. Swimming across the Niagara River or something like that?
The Appalachian Trail is probably the most analogous.
That's very long, though. Yeah,
yeah, much longer. People will hike parts of the Appalachian Trail. Some people will do the whole thing, which I think probably starts maybe in Tennessee, something like that, and goes all the way up to, I want to say, Vermont or New Hampshire, somewhere up there. I don't know if it makes it to Maine, maybe, but tells you how much I know about it. But it does go through near where I live, and I've hiked some of it, but nowhere as ambitious as 5 days, like some lunatics.
Yeah, the only thing I know about Vermont is that Joey in Friends decides he's leaving the country, and when they ask where he's going, he says Vermont. So I quite enjoy that.
Well, it is a bit different in Vermont, I will say that. Burlington's a lovely place. I love Burlington.
Oh, don't! I'm going to be over on your shores soon, and I'm thoroughly looking forward to it, I have to say.
It's like 2,200 miles, the Appalachian Trail. So
yeah, it's long. That takes months. People do it. I think it's like a couple of months it takes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this was actually six days. It was only 84 miles, so nothing quite like that.
Yeah, that sounds more like the West Highland Way. I think it's another one in Scotland that people do. But so no, I just want to know how many pubs were along the way, Alan.
Not many.
Oh, not none. That's not zero. I don't know what kind of a hike this is.
We actually, there was one day that we actually stopped. The stop point was a pub, so of course we had to go in for a.
Of course it was
a climax pint, as I call it.
Jeez, a climax pint! Oh my goodness, I've all sorts going on. But anyway, let's crack on with the football chat now, guys. A seismic event happened on Twitter this week. I actually deleted a tweet. I stepped back from a comment I made about the club being slow to act, and one of the signs of this being that they hadn't announced Kieran Tierney's signing. Cue hordes of abusive people telling me I didn't understand football and I didn't understand the legalities of how these things work, which is obviously nonsense, because within 24 hours, Celtic come to my rescue and announce the signing of Kieran Tierney, despite the fact his contract supposedly doesn't end until the 30th of March with Arsenal. But anyway, he is officially a Celtic player again. James, I'll come to you first on this one. What's your feelings on Kieran Tierney coming back? What does it signify in terms of the impact it's going to have on the squad for you?
Well, those are two separate questions. We're not allowed to have feelings on this show, so we have to just skip over that. No, feelings are great. I mean, it's. I think it's impossible not to be very happy about it as a Celtic supporter. So I'd be surprised if there's many that are having anything other than a very positive emotional response to it. As far as what it means to the kind of competitive dynamics of the team, that's a lot more complicated. And I think we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing. There's a lot of dimensions to that. I think the first one is strategically, does allocating the amount of resources that are being allocated to him as a left back make sense? I think that's just kind of how many teams in our peer group have functionally their highest paid player right there as a left back. I think that's a question. There's no question he's an upgrade, and he's probably going to end up being the best player on the team when he plays, which is a whole another aspect of this. But if he's on one of the highest wages, and let's say, I don't know, a couple of million a year, it's a 5-year contract. I mean, that's for Celtic, that's a big outlay on a relative basis. So just strategically, does that make sense for the left back position as opposed to striker, central midfield, a creative midfielder, even a center back, like a ball playing top of the line center back? So I think that's the kind of a first strategic question. Second one is, the potential, or what's the risk bands on your return on investment because of his fitness issues. If your best player is maybe going to play, or one of your highest paid players is only going to play maybe 2 or 2,500 minutes in the season, maybe 3,000. We'd be delighted with that, probably, I think, over the term of the 5 years. Then that's a second thing. I mean, it's one thing to pay Callum McGregor £2 million a year, and he's going to play 5,000 minutes, versus, Tierney roughly the same amount and maybe only play in, 3,000 minutes, for example. So I think that's a question. So I'll stop there, because those are two kind of just general strategic questions. And then that flows down then to tactics, and are we going to change tactics, and what kind of positions do we need if that's the case, and all of that. So it's a seminal return. I think it might highlight a important change in the way that the team plays relative to kind of the post-Ange, I should say, post-Lennon era, starting with Ange. So that it could be much more important than just a prodigal son returning.
Yeah, Alan, there's a strange romanticism amongst the Celtic support for bringing players back. We've had the perennial argument that Paddy Roberts would be coming back to us at some point. Why, I'm not sure. As much as I loved the Jota return, the jury's still out on how successful that is going to be, especially now that he's injured. What's your first impressions of the fact that we even wanted to bring Tierney back, and the fact that it's then been successful in happening?
So firstly, we're bringing in a player who is an absolutely top-class player, and in any other circumstance we would not be able to afford at all, right? Is objectively, I think, true. Other than the existing Celtic connection and the clear affection that Tierney himself has for the club, other than that, this would not be a deal that would be possible for Celtic to do under current wage constraints and budget constraints and what have you. The second thing I'd say is we're actually, as James says, potentially the best player in the squad, and we're upgrading the weakest part of the team. So now suddenly it's arguably could be the strongest part of the team. That's a good thing, right? Having said all that, the wage allocation thing, I get the point, but I think there's sufficient fat in the squad that we should be able to cut 6 or 7 players and buy 2 or 3 of the quality of Tierney, and then start to fill up the bench with 18, 19-year-olds of high quality. And we'll come on to the Fulham kid striker in a moment. So there's a path through this that allows you to have an expensive left back. It's not an easy path, but it is doable. So and then you come to the question, as James says, of risks and specifically injury, and let's get it out right. Since he's been at Arsenal, Tierney has missed 100 matches. That's 20 a season. Okay. So and these are muscle injuries. These are knee, hamstring, ankle. These are nasty things. These are not knocks or an unfortunate leg break, which can even heal stronger than it ever was. So these are muscle injuries, which potentially are weaknesses that will always be there. And essentially, our most expensive player and arguably our best player, based on historical data, is likely to be at best available for half the games. There's no precedent really throughout his career. I mean, the most matches that he's ever played in the Premier League, I think he played in something like 27 matches one season for Arsenal. But that wasn't 27 times 90 minutes. It was less than that. So these are all genuine risks. The most starts he's ever made in a league season was when he was 20 years old at Celtic, where he started 30 out of 36 matches. He's never started above 20, above 26 since then. I'm just talking about league games there. So that's not always to do with injury. Obviously, Arsenal was a hugely competitive environment. And therefore, some of that was just to do with the strength of the Arsenal squad, etc. So, on the one hand, this is to be celebrated, but and as I say, I'd look at it as strengthening the weakest part of the team. But I think we also need another left back that is going to be very, very good as well, and I think that's going to be the tricky bit.
Certainly is, and we'll come back to you on some more thoughts about the left back position a little bit later on the show. But James, I wanted to pick up on what Alan was saying there about the elephant that is in the room as far as Kieran Tierney is concerned. His injury history is well known. It was well known before he left Celtic. It was prevalent during his time at Arsenal, and indeed he's actually coming back to Celtic having withdrawn from the latest Scotland squad through injury. So, it's an ongoing feature. I guess my question to you in that case would be, how worth it to you is it to have a player of that quality and paying him that amount of money, knowing that the number of games he's going to play is probably going to be limited? Do you still feel like he can have a positive impact even with that kind of hanging over him?
Yeah, I think so, if it's done intelligently, meaning that if the risks are managed, if the probabilities of his game time are allocated towards the most important games against the best opponents. Like, it doesn't really matter if he misses, 20 games against the equivalent of Falkirk and, I'm remembering who got relegated and who didn't, so I don't misspeak. But Livingston now, with Ross County and St. Johnstone going down. There it is. I knew it would get there sometime. So, is it a big deal if he misses some of those games, particularly on, Saturdays following a Champions League game and that kind of thing? Does he need to play in the? Does he need to play in the League Cup, for God's sakes? I'd say no.
Can I just jump in on that, though? Because I know we're going to have a bit of a conversation about change of shape and things like that, but you're arguably saying there then that Livingston, for example, with the pitch that they've got, Carter Vickers and Kieran Tierney would likely not be starters in that game because of their injury history. So 2 of a potential first choice back 4, we're saying, yeah, there's at least 2 games a season they're definitely not going to play.
Yeah, and I'm okay with that. Like, we're at a point with are quality gap over clubs of that size that second string players should be able to be rotated in proactively to support the performance level and health of the most important players without, having a panic attack that we're going to drop points at Livingston. So again, that circles back to recruitment. And as Alan said, you got to have a 1A with Tierney because of the situation, because of the risks. And that further complicates the question about the left back position, meaning that this is not just allocating the amount to Tierney. It's that you probably have to overspend like people were lobbying for Greg Taylor to be that 1A and paying him, I don't know what he's going to end up getting in Greece, but let's say it's $20,000 a week. Are you going to pay the equivalent of, let's say, $60,000 a week for your two left backs for a team like Celtic? Like, that's kind of crazy. So that creates its own kind of issues. The other part of this is that the nature of the injury that he sustained at Celtic was the type that can lead to, and it's all I've read about it with his hip, is the fact that he's having kind of chronic imbalance injuries, I guess I'll call it, meaning that he may not feel the same way running now as he did. I'm totally speculating, but just again, reading on the type of severity of the injury he had, where it's not unusual for people to take 2 years or more to recover from fully. That may not be a contributing factor to having some of these soft tissue injuries, because he just, his body got messed up and it's hard to maybe even recover back fully to where he was when he was 19, for example. The other thing, just to put this conversation and minutes played into perspective, I looked it up. In that 2017-18 season, which was the last season he played, I'd call it fully fit, where he didn't miss time of any consequence due to injury. So if you add up all his minutes across friendlies, international duty, all competition at Celtic, it was a little over 5,400 minutes. And if you look at all of his minutes in the English Premier League and in Spain when he was out on loan, it's 8,194 minutes over 6 seasons, right? So that gives you an idea of what does a fully fledged, full-time Celtic player who's on international duty as well, who's fully fit, the minutes that they log, as he did and as Callum McGregor used to do as a matter of course, relative to how much he's played since he left. So it's orders of magnitude different. So, so I think, I still think it's worth it if it's done smart, because as Alan said, this is a one-off case. We keep having these one-off cases, which makes it sound like they, Jota's return and the money from Saudi, all these other things that have happened, but we would not get this level of player, even with his injury track record, for the amount that we're going to pay him. So because of that, I think it's important. But as we talked about in recent weeks, this is another one of these risks that you stack on top of other risks. And if it's not handled smartly, then it could add to other issues and end up kind of creating much bigger problems, because of, there's just inherent risks here that are known. And that's above and beyond other potential unknowable risks, like Alan said, anyone can break a leg, anyone can do an ACL, like all of these other things that we just saw with Jota. So, still worth doing, but it's going to require some smart risk management.
Yeah, Alan, in terms of risk management, part of what James touched on there is having an appropriately, competent second choice for the left back position. A player that you've been concentrating on recently with your end of season write-ups is Greg Taylor. Still no word on where he'll be next season, and I take into account James's point about not spending too much of your wage budget on two left backs. But what's your opinion based on what you've surmised about Greg Taylor, about maybe the pros of keeping him on as a second choice left back or an alternate to Kieran Tierney?
Yeah, I mean, almost the fact that we've signed Tierney doesn't alter, I think, what we can state as a fact over the last, I don't know how far you want to go back, but certainly to when Tierney left, which is the club has been absolutely awful at recruiting left backs. And Greg Taylor, bless him, has actually been the standout performer in that position for 5 seasons, and deservedly has been the first choice. If you stack Greg Taylor's numbers, if you like, performance data up against the population of Celtic fullbacks, i.e., all the right backs as well, he doesn't profile very well, right? But he profiles better than all the other left backs that we've signed, right? Now, it's not easy to sign left backs. There's not as many of them. There's not as many left footers as there are right footers. And we also seem to have been stuck in this, I don't know whether it's fog of confusion or whether it's just different managers having different ideas, whereby we alternate between buying very defensive left backs, like Diego Latzalt, for example, is a good example of one. I know he was on loan, and very attacking ones like a Bernabei or a Vai. So what is it we want to do? Do you want a pseudo winger, a Vai or a Bernabei, or do you want a fullback, like more like a sort of on the right hand side a Kenny or a Abd Helmad or a Elmad or a Laxal or somebody like that. So what we got with Greg Taylor was actually somebody who was incredibly adaptable. In his first 2 seasons, when he was used as a fairly orthodox attacking left back, he's bound to be an attacking left back playing for Celtic. His creative numbers were actually very good. They were really good. His defensive numbers weren't so great. When Ange got hold of him and turned him into an inverted fullback, his attacking numbers dropped off because he simply wasn't being asked to do that job, and his kind of ball progression numbers went like that, and his defending's improved as he's got older. So this is a player who is incredibly admirable on many levels in terms of attitude, adaptability, willingness to learn, willingness to improve, willingness to do what he's been asked to do. But unfortunately, it's all at a level that is probably slightly below what we need at the club. That's not Greg Taylor's fault. He's done the best he can. We're going to have exactly the same conversation about Liam Scales. It's exactly the same scenario. Perfectly admirable, magnificent attitude, doing everything asked of him, showing improvement in areas that are important to the particular manager. Has seen off a number of competitors. Right, it's exactly the same scenario. So, great. And I just think with Greg Taylor at 27, with a young family, he needs to be maxing out on what he can get personally in terms of income to set up his family for the rest of their lives. And at 27, he needs to be a regular. So we've just said that he may end up playing half the games, but if half the games are away at Kilmarnock or away at Falkirk, then not at all in the Champions League, for example, then is that an attractive proposition? So we've recruited left backs historically very badly. The fact that Kieran Tierney's fallen into the club's lap is not great recruitment. It's just happenstance, really. It's just circumstances. And fair play to the club for making it happen, and fair play to both Tierney and the club for being able to come to an accommodation where he can be fitted into the squad within our wage structure. And it is all good. But it doesn't alter the fact that we're terrible at recruiting left backs, and we continue to be terrible at recruiting left backs. So, hence the risks, as James talks about, of which games will Tierney be available for, and how much can we afford to put into a position that we've historically been terrible at recruiting players for? ? We don't know.
Yeah, we're so bad at recruiting fullbacks in general. I would say that some of those names you brought up before, I was like, who? Can't remember them. But yeah. Bring back Tosh McKinley and Tom Boyd, that's fantasy.
Well,
but anyway,
yeah, absolutely. I just say, sorry, there was the last thing on Tierney for me is that things which professional footballers talk about and data analysts don't tend to talk about is you're also getting a player who is going to, players talk about and managers talk about standards. You're talking about somebody who on the training ground every day is going to be absolutely 100% driving not just himself but everybody else to a high standard, who knows exactly what it takes to play for Celtic, who knows they have to win every game, like McGregor, like Forrest, and their different styles of personalities that they are, will be driving that squad and being a presence in the dressing room of making sure that people do not slip. Because that, we've just lost a Scottish Cup final, a treble on our plate. How much of that was complacency? There's maybe an element of that in there, and if that's going to creep in because of the gaps that James talks about, even in this new landscape of Scottish football that's very exciting, that's emerging, that we don't know what it's going to look like, and there's a lot of uncertainty. But what I can say is that for all the clubs that are going through transition, they will have to be patient because the results will unlikely to be immediate. Even having said all that, you still need to keep Celtic need to keep doing what they're doing, and in fact keep improving. So Tierney will be a huge boost to the dressing room, to the standards of the club, to the ethos, to the culture of the club. But that is also his downfall, because Tierney is a player that only knows how to play one way. He only has one speed and one level of intensity at which he plays, and I'm sure that doesn't help him. I'm sure a canny, experienced pro would know that, I can probably contribute effectively here when we're 3-0 up at home to Kilmarnock, playing at 80% of my capabilities. You don't get that with Tierney. He's always at it. He's always on it, always 100%. And that possibly, I don't know, contributes a little bit to his history of injury as well. If he managed himself in a more canny way, maybe that might help him avoid some of these injuries. I don't know. That might be unfair. I don't mean it to be. It's just a an observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're stuck between a rock and a hard place when that's the situation you're in as a footballer, because you've got 60,000 people every week wanting you to give your all, and then you do, and you kind of end up on the treatment table again, and people get annoyed at you for that. So I don't envy him having to make that decision of how much to put into each game. But I certainly agree that he probably doesn't need to put 100% in, and he would be more than capable of managing most of the opponents that he comes up against. James, I'll come to you to discuss our supposed new signing. Certainly, Celts are here. Another Celtic fan media outlet are reporting that we are on the verge of signing 19-year-old Callum Osmond from Fulham. He is a striker. I've got to say, I was kind of so what about this? The only reason being, we've just sold Joey Dawson back to Scunthorpe United, having arrived in 2022 and made a grand total of, I think, one competitive appearance for the Celtic first team. I could go back through numerous other players, Armstrong, Okoflex, other players of that nature who are supposedly very well sought after and come to Celtic despite having offers from all the giants of Europe. Tell me I'm missing something here. Tell me we've uncovered the next... Well, I'll say the next Matt O'Reilly, even though he's not the same type of player, but that's the last player we signed from Fulham. Tell me that's where we're headed.
We don't know. I mean, I did my usual benchmarking exercise with the caveat that it was, I think, 1,100 plus minutes in Premier League 2. So it's a bunch of 19-year-olds basically in that league. There's some a little older than that, and there's some a little younger. But generally, most of the teams have a mean age right around 19. And he was one of the best performing strikers. He was, I think, second highest goal rate, second highest non-penalty XG per 90 minutes played. So, I mean, that's all good. How does that translate into, playing for Celtic? That there's a level issue there. And one of the things I've been critical of the recruitment in the past has been the misalignment of evidence that they can fulfill the role that they're being asked to play. So the way that Fulham played, it appears, again, just doing a statistical analysis, I'm not pretending as if I've watched Premier League 2 Fulham much in my life at all. Actually, it's officially 0. But looking at the statistical evidence is that they're kind of, in the neighborhood of how Celtic plays. So they're more possession-centric. For that league, they were, their passing rate was relatively high. I mean, they're not playing long ball. They're playing, what most people would consider kind of progressive attacking football. And he was a striker in that type of system. And, he was more along the lines of a striker on the ball more than like how we've deployed Kyogo in recent years, where they, if they touch a ball 10 times in a game, it's like not abnormal. So all of those, I think, are good signs. The potential negatives is that his profile wasn't that robust. He had a lot of kind of areas that look like he might have some room for development if he's going to play more of a Rodgers striker, the way we think about it traditionally, dropping as a 9, almost like a false 9 at times, helping him build up. I would say that his metrics there were mixed, and I'm probably being a little charitable there as far as how good he would be right now, and as far as being someone who drops deep, controls the ball, and then facilitates buildup in that way. Now, again, and that's at the Premier League 2 level. That's not playing against average age 28-year-olds in Scotland in February when the pitches have gone to hell, and the complexities of all of these things stress one's technical abilities even more in the specific environment at Celtic. So I think he fits this framework of what Rodgers has said basically since he returned, which is he wants a third striker and he wants him being young, a development striker, and he certainly fits that. And I think there's enough there because it's such a low cost acquisition that speculatively, I think it makes sense because, development is not linear. He's still 19 and I think he turns 20 relatively soon, but still could have a lot of development to go. And if he's utilized again in a smart way, if he's not being asked to play like Dembele did, if that's not his strong suit, then I think it's a worthy speculation. I think that the issue about these cross-border acquisitions of kind of castaway English players, we did have a bigger flirtation with that under Lennon's tenure with the guy, I always forget his name, who was the nominal head of recruitment at the time. And we had, that was the source of Frimpong. So that was the home run. But for every Frimpong, there was like 5 guys who we signed that never really appeared, in any meaningful
For every
minutes.
Frimpong, there was a Ben Hutchison or something similar, yeah.
Yeah, Apolabi, there was O'Connell, there was a couple others that are
Sadie Jenko.
That was even preceding that. Yeah. Although, again, in fairness, Janko's a good example. He's a guy who went on to have a very good career at a good level, just playing a different style of football, and he probably matured a little bit later. So, every individual's different in their kind of maturation and development arc. So I'm okay with the signing. I think, the question for me is more so from the player perspective, is sitting on the bench at Celtic as a third striker. And we've seen how much we use third strikers, which is probably going to be next to nil. So is there going to be a commitment to play him in the League Cup, for example? Right? That's the kind of thing that you would say, oh, well, if I'm going to have a high profile, nominally, talented, promising, pedigreed striker who we really want to come on, they've got to get game time. So when are you going to do that? And that's my question about what's the development plan? How are they going to actually get this guy to where he needs to be? Does that mean, 6 months at the club and then go out on loan? That kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see more in the preseason what level he's actually at and whether he looks like he fits the part. And then the second act of that will be, okay, well, how much do we actually use him? So overall, content with it is probably how I would characterize it. Most of that is because it really comes almost free. It's not a big allocation of resources.
Yeah, I mean, Alan, I'm saying this from a position of ignorance, as I do most things on this podcast. James has obviously done benchmarking, and I appreciate that he knows a little bit more than me about the player in general. But for me, certainly, it smacks a little bit of. I have no evidence of this, but maybe agent connections finding a move. Celtic have got a previous relationship with Fulham. There's obviously pathways there that players are aware of. Am I being too harsh on that? Do you think there's more intention behind this signing than maybe I'm giving it credit for?
I suppose I could invent an opinion on that based on my prejudices, but I've got no information either way on that. So if you don't mind, I'll sidestep that because I haven't a clue.
Expertly done, Alan. Brilliant.
What I can say is I did ask an expert on about him because James's benchmarking exercises are great. I absolutely love them. They have a lot of value. In these cases, I think they're of much less value. And I'm not saying that to denigrate what James has done. What I mean, let me explain myself, is that English Premier League 2, these teams might change 5 or 6 players every week. This kid's not playing up front with the same wingers or even the same formations, right? And he's hardly played any minutes anyway. Right? This is a very fluid environment. The clubs just use these as a way to develop players, and it's more about the development of player than it is about the building of a team and a coherence and a structure and a way of playing. There might be certain aspects of first team play they want to mimic, pressing signals and all that, fine. But they're trying to develop players for the first team. They're not trying to develop to be the best team in that league, and therefore the connections with individual players, which will then have an impact on the stats and the data. There's a lot of noise in there, is what I'm saying. There's a lot of variability, more so than if you were looking at a player who'd maybe played, I don't know, 100 games in the Maltese league, right? This is, that would be relatively predictable compared to this. So there's a lot of variability there. So I asked my Fulham contact, a chap called Jack J Collins on Twitter. He's an analyst, does a lot of data stuff for Fulham. He's got the Fulham-ish pod as well. Recommend you follow him on X. He's very good and very, very amenable and hospitable to my questions. His view was, this isn't a Musa Dembele part 2, right? Musa Dembele was a relatively seasoned English Championship level player. He was battle hardened at that level.
He was already a man.
He'd won full season, and you're right in terms of physicality as well. So Jack mentioned Kieran Bowie, now of Hibs. Kieran Bowie has got many more first team minutes under his belt. I think he's the same age or similar age. I think 1920 as Osmand, and they were seen as being a kind of striking pair, if you like. But Bowie simply got more minutes because they felt able to loan him out to a League One or a League Two club simply because of his physicality. So there's a lot of physical development that's going to be needed by Callum, from what he says. But what we're getting is a player who looks like got a great profile as being an in the box striker. So Kyogo, I think, in terms of that sort of profile. I'm not saying he's as good as Kyogo. I'm saying it's that kind of profile that we're looking at here. Somebody who's incredibly mobile, which I like. Pressing is not going to be an issue, apparently. He's going to be very active and engaged in that because of his movement and his speed. His mobility, especially, but he just simply has got no first team experience. So it's very much, as James found some signals in the data there, and rightly so, is that when I looked at that data, I thought, not a great passing game. I don't see much evidence of a great passing game, but his goal creation stats were very good, meaning that, and I put this to Jack, and he says, yes, he's very inventive around the box, which again I like, and that all speaks to potentially a little signal there of a striker that can make things happen in very crowded penalty areas. I may be reading too much into that. I probably am. But there's a little hint there that might be something that this lad has got. So, they're super sad as a rule to be losing him, but I think Fulham have lost a lot of young players, as we have. But again, other than Ben Doak, how many of the young lads that have been plucked away from Celtic before they got anywhere near the first team? The Morrisons, I can't even remember all their names. How many of them are actually, can you now look at and say, oh, God, we really lost a player there. He's been fantastic. I can't think of any other than Ben Doak, who we knew had a lot of talent. So this is how, supporters tend to look at when they lose young players. They're generally sad about it. They generally think they've lost something more than what they may have done. So we don't know what we're going to get. That's what I say. He's got some good signals in there, some promising aspects. As as fans, we tend to look for the positives in this. But the one thing I would say is it probably is not good news for Paddy, for Kenny. I mean, where does that leave him really as that third striker now? So that's one to look out for as well.
The other, if I could just real quick, the other, to me, important part of this signing is the context of where the market is. And that if you, to use kind of crazy outliers, we just had a Champions League final where, 17 to 19-year-olds were prominently featured and playing hugely important roles. And again, if you go through, because I'm a lunatic, I do this. I look at all the teams that were in the Champions League and even the Europa League, including teams that we kind of consider part of our peer group in a European level, and they are littered, not with 17-year-olds. That's unusual, but they're littered with 19 and 20-year-olds. Not all of them. I mean, Salzburg's probably the most radical and has been for a while, but it's commonplace for them to have 2, 3, 4 starters that are teenagers. And so and we've talked about this because of in many occasions in recent months about the impact of FSR and PSR in England and what that's doing to the pushing of demand for talent being younger, because of, usually can sign them for lower wages and still get high levels of production. So this is creating a more competitive environment for acquiring talent in this age group. And I think the fact that if we're going to be signing players that are of a ready to go, a Moussa Dembele level where you could just say, I'm ready to rock, put me in and play. There's no way on, that we could get Moussa Dembele today. The market has shifted too much for that quality of a player at that age. Unless there's major issues about concern, or with Edouard there was a behavioral question, right? So there's always going to be those kind of niche situations potentially where you're willing to accept some other risk, but generally speaking, that part of the market is going berserk. So we're not likely to find, or if I'm one of these top 19-year-olds, why would I go to Celtic? Where's our track record of playing 19-year-olds as being a lockdown starter? So there's, give and take on this. And I think just the reorientation of what is young is important. And if you look at our team last season, our young players were definitively middle age in this new kind of paradigm within the marketplace. 23 is not young anymore. That's the age that, the top clubs are looking to buy now. That used to be 25, 26. They proved it. The Liverpools, the Real Madrids, they would, buy those middle 20s type and even later 20 age players. And that's all shifting down now into early 20s.
Well, here's a question I've got for you then, and feel free both of you to answer it, but I'll ask James first. I guess the thing that frustrated me when I saw this signing coming up was we've got a player who has got a lot of hype around him in Daniel Cummings, who's the same age as Callum Osmond, who we're supposed to be bringing in. We're talking about a second choice left back that we're wanting when we've got Mitchell Frame on the books, who's been much hyped for years. We're talking about trying to find a long-term replacement for Callum McGregor when Francis Turley's getting a lot of hype around him as well. There's 3 youngsters I can name off the top of my head that have received a lot of fanfare, and yet there doesn't seem to be any suggestion that they are going to feature regularly, if at all, for Celtic next season, if they're even still here. I mean, why aren't we utilising these players and trying to find the next Forrest or McGregor or Tierney?
Well, I think it's a very complicated issue. I think there are legitimate, and again, I'm in no means an expert. I think the guys at Celtic Underground do a really good job of covering some of this stuff on the academy side and what's going on there, and strategically some of the deficiencies in recent years that I think a lot of people closer to the situation aren't happy with. So there's a pathway issue. There's a quality of academy issue. But because of those, and because our better players, and this is again not unique to Celtic, it's a countrywide and even when I say country, Scotland-wide, but it's also a kind of below the first tier issue in academies in England, is they get poached by bigger resource clubs because they can just, Chelsea can buy a bazillion, and I think they're almost there, a bazillion youngsters, and just stockpile them and then loan them out and, make money off of trading talent as opposed to even having a reasonable expectation that they're going to be a Chelsea player. So that those market conditions have been really tough. So long-winded way of saying the players may not be good enough. That is possible. Like Rodgers may be looking at them in training or collaborating with the other people in the staff and saying, well, they're just not ready yet. And as much as I loved McCardle's 20 minutes, and I'm hoping, and projecting on him that he's our 17-year-old wonder kid, maybe he's not ready. So that could be part of the gap here, is that maybe a lot of them aren't good enough to be ready, because the ones that are leave. And the other thing I'll say is, because if some of the things I've read on the academy side, as far as, not being, let's say, world-class in how they're treating players and families and that kind of stuff, that creates scar tissue. And a guy like Cummings has that scar tissue, and maybe his parents have scar tissue in dealing with coming up through that system, and a fresh player doesn't. So, it could be partly that. So it's plausible that Cummings is not that different on a talent basis as this guy, but he's ready to go somewhere else because it just hasn't worked for him. And that happens. Sometimes places just aren't a good fit for individuals. So that could be part of the equation as well.
You mean we're not applying world-class basics to how we run things? No.
That's breakfasts.
Yeah, Alan, I'll just come back to you on everything we've discussed there, a quick wee answer, because I know we've got to shoot off pretty quickly. But, I find it a very inefficient way of running a club that you could invest in the 19-year-old they've already spent years training, rather than either spending money or getting a player in for free on what will potentially be an inflated wage, the way that we seem to be doing with Osmond. Am I just completely missing the point here?
No, but as James says, it is complicated and it's not linear, and the development paths are not linear. And there's a fundamental problem that Scotland has, which is there is no pathway to get young players into the first team. There is no pathway. This country is failing to provide a pathway for these players. Celtic are trying to work around it with some, sending a couple of players a year out to the Austrian second division. There's now rumour that we're going to have a hookup with Queen's Park, and maybe that a few players will be sent there next season. I mean, crikey, Queen's Park are kind of on a bit of a downward slope, so I'm not sure it's the best club that they could go to, but but we're having to kind of invent pathways, really, because of this. And people say, "Oh, Daniel Cummins, yeah, he scored 21 goals in the whatever the league they're in, Lowland League." Yeah, well, it's like 10 guys that scored more than that. Should we sign them? It's a really bad standard. It doesn't tell you very much at all. And this is the problem. And it's not Celtic's fault. Celtic are trying to work around this to some extent. You could argue that they could do better, and I've no doubt that they could. But the environment is not set up in Scotland to develop young players, and it's a structural issue that's a problem with the game. And until that's resolved, then it's very difficult to know how much of it is down to the factors that James was talking about there. How much is it down to just the fact that we don't have this means of progression? We don't have a reserve league. We don't have a B teams that are playing at a good level, and all of that. So you got to resolve that first and provide the environment, and then you can start to scrutinise. Well, how are you then utilising players within that environment? But it's very difficult to get to the bottom of it, so long as that is the case, unfortunately. But Celtic had, I think, Scotland's coefficient excellent site. Please follow it, subscribe to it. Pointed out, I think Celtic had maybe the second oldest squad in terms of minutes played by players of certain age bands in the league last season. Now some of that's obviously, you take out McGregor, you take out Schmeichel, that kind of does reduce the age somewhat, but still, it's a long way for Celtic to get to the level of some Champions League peers that are playing maybe 3 or 4 teenagers or 20-year-olds from where we are today. We've been linked with a few young players, and the Fulham kid, the Serbian kid who I can't even begin to remember what his name was, the defensive midfielder that James wrote about earlier in the week. This is a long game, right? We're not going to suddenly go from having one of the oldest squads in the league to playing a bunch of 20-year-olds at Champions League level. This is going to be a long And maybe that's one part of Paul Tisdale's remit is to edge us further down that road. But the Scottish environment is working against him, and the general footballing environment, as James has said, about how competitive it is to find kids at that age, young men at that age who are could compete at the Champions League level, is such a saturated market as far as intel. The fact that James can even find Y-Scout data in detail about all these metrics for a kid that's never played a game of first team football is just gives you some indication. Imagine what the really smart clubs are doing. The other side to it, my last point is the Chelsea hoovering up all these youngsters and other mega clubs doing the same. There's still a huge amount of wastage in the system, and that's where Celtic need to be operating, is identifying where there's that wastage and where little gems are being missed, and because they will be there amongst all these kind of horrible. Because I hate it. It's this harvesting of young people, shifting them around Europe, and selling them the dream of playing for these mega clubs, and most of them never will. So there's still waste in the system to be exploited if clubs are smart.
Well, and that's just last thing I'll say is even to use a crazy hypothetical, is if we had world-class academy and just by luck, a Scottish Yamal was 15. The equivalent of a 15-year-old Yamal in Scotland in Celtic's academy. That's a world-class academy. Where's he going when he's 15 and 16? Where's he playing? Like, how is that world-class talent with world-class coaching and development on a micro basis within the academy? Where is he playing his games? Where is he going to develop and grow as a player? I mean, it's stunting. So to Alan's point, I mean, even if we were to get all of that right, if the whole system is broken and not providing an ecosystem to nurture talent, then guess what? He would have left. His family would have said, let's get the hell out of here, because it makes no sense to stay.
Yeah, I'm now thinking of a 16-year-old phenom from Scotland called Lamine Yerma. I think that's what he would be called. But let's cross our fingers that he comes across our books at some point in the future. If you want to hear more detail of what Alan and James have thought of the season past and the ongoing transfers and things of the summer, you can access all their writings at huddlebreakdown.com, where you can also get full access to our previous episodes and our Huddle Breakdown Extra Time with Martin that usually airs later on in the week. Anything you guys want to add before we sign off?
I'll just say that we didn't actually get around to the conversation, which would have been a very interesting one, hopefully, about what does the signing of Tierney mean for the dynamics of how the team is set up. So we'll dive into that in Thursday extra time, or Thursdays where we record, in extra time style in a lot of detail later in the week. So please join us for that.
Absolutely. I'm sure Martin and these two guys will be much better informed on that than I will be. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you everybody for watching and listening, and we will see you again next week.